All right, I want to look at one. Start off by doing like a tiny correction in Steve Moyse's discussion of Luke 19, because it's not just to correct it. It's because once we look at this, it kind of opens up a fun conversation, and kind of an interesting interpretive issue. So yeah, in Luke 19, Jesus is entering Jerusalem. His disciples are rejoicing and praising God, and they say, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest." That line's already loaded with Old Testament resonance. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, comes from Psalm 118. But Luke says, "Blessed is the King." So disciples are not merely excited that Jesus has arrived. They're announcing him as the King who comes in the name of the Lord. But then some of the Pharisees say to Jesus, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." In other words, tell them to stop them from saying these royal messianic things about you. And Jesus answers, I bet you've heard this before. "I tell you, if these were silent, what? The stones would cry out." Now, if you went to church, if you grew up in church like I did, like you probably could finish that sentence whenever I gave you the opportunity to do that. And maybe you've heard how this line from Jesus is often preached and shows up in our worship songs. We usually think that it means something like, hey, Jesus is going to be praised one way or another. If we don't worship him, man, the rocks themselves are going to cry out and worship Jesus. And it's not a crazy thought, because there's lots of passages in the Old Testament where creation worships God. Psalm 96 says, "The heavens rejoice, the earth is glad, the seas roar, the fields exult, the trees sing for joy." Psalm 98 says, "The rivers clap their hands and the hills sing together for joy." Psalm 148 calls on mountains, trees, hills, animals, kings, and peoples to praise the Lord. Isaiah 55 says, "The mountains and hills will break forth into singing, and the trees will clap their hands." Not crazy for the Bible, the biblical tradition, to speak of creation praising God. But Moyse, draws out an important connection, as do other commentators. Though there's a typo, the correction I wanted to point out on page 87 is that Moyse references Habakkuk 2:1, and clearly it's supposed to be Habakkuk 2:11. Habakkuk 2:1 is the watchtower verse, where Habakkuk says he'll stand at his watch post and wait to see what the Lord will say. 2:11 says, "The stone will cry out from the wall and the beam from the woodwork answer," which is a verse we've actually already dealt with. That's where the Targum and the Pesher scroll from Qumran talks about it crying out about robbery and oppression. So in Habakkuk 2, this is the place where we're going to hear stones crying out. If there's going to be an activation in the tradition of stones crying out, it's not going to be in any of those psalms where other parts of creation are singing praises. Stones crying out is a pretty clear activation of Habakkuk 2:11. And in Habakkuk 2, the stones aren't crying out in worship, are they? They're crying out as a witness. The context as a whole the context as a whole is an oracle against those who build their houses and cities through violence, exploitation, robbery, and bloodshed. Habakkuk says, "Woe to him who gets evil gain for his house. And then woe to him who builds a town with blood and founds a city on iniquity." So when the stone cries out from the wall, the image is not creation singing a praise chorus. The image is more like a courtroom testimony. The wall itself testifies against the builder. The house says, "I know what I was built on. I know the violence and robbery embedded in these walls." Kind of a far cry, pun intended, from the way a lot of us have heard Luke 19. Now, to be fair, and the Greek verbal connection between Luke and Habakkuk is not super strong. Luke and Habakkuk have stone language, but the verb for cry out is different. Habakkuk uses one Greek verb for crying out, and Luke uses a different one. So we definitely wouldn't see this as a quotation of Habakkuk from Luke. But then again, we don't hear about stones crying out with any verb very often. I think this is the place. If there's a connection about stones crying out, it's from Habakkuk 2:11. And the connection gets pretty interesting when you look at what happens next in Luke. Immediately after Jesus says, if these were silent, the stones would cry out, Luke tells us that Jesus sees the city and weeps over it. He says, would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make for peace, but they are hidden from your eyes. Then Jesus announces the coming judgment of Jerusalem. Your enemies will set up a barricade around you and surround you and hem you in on every side, and they will not leave one stone upon another in you because you did not know the time of your visitation. And man, if Jesus said that his house was supposed to be a house of prayer, but they've made it into a den of robbers, would it be so crazy? I mean, this may be stretching it. I may be getting into TikTok connections in the text arena here. But if there was already this traditio of stones crying out in robbery, and Jesus is saying this about the stones of the temple, maybe the temple would cry out, and that there's robbers in the temple. I don't know. But there's definitely some traditional connections here. But we definitely will hear the stones line differently. Jesus says the stones would cry out. Then just a few verses later, he says the stones of Jerusalem will be torn down. That means the stones are probably not just random rocks on the side of the road. In Luke's narrative context, the stones are tied to Jerusalem itself, the city that failed to recognize the time of God's visitation, the stones in the temple. And so if Habakkuk is being activated here, Jesus' point is not simply, if humans stop worshiping me, rocks will start worshiping me instead. It's kind of sharper than that. It's more like, if my disciples are silenced, the stones will testify against the violence, against the oppression, against the robbery that my people are committing against me. And in Luke's immediate context, that testimony is judgment. The disciples recognize the king who comes in the name of the Lord. The Pharisees want the recognition silenced. Jerusalem does not know the things that make for peace. And Jesus says that if the living witnesses are silent, the evidence itself will speak, will testify against them. So that's the surprise. The popular church memory version says, if we don't worship, the rocks will worship. And I'm not going to let the rocks worship. I'm going to worship. I'm not going to be silent. But the Habakkuk connection says, if you silence the witnesses, the stones will testify against you. And in Luke 19, the testimony of the stones is tragic. Jesus is not gloating over Jerusalem. He's weeping over it. He's lamenting a city that could not recognize the King of Peace when he came. So this is why intertextuality matters in activation. We're not just looking for clever cross-references. We're trying to hear the larger world of meaning that a biblical author may be activating. If Luke is drawing on the broader creation praise tradition, then yes, there's this sense in which all creation recognizes the reign of God. But if Luke is echoing Habakkuk 2:11, which it seems like that he is, then the stones are not merely backup worship leaders. They're courtroom witnesses. They're not here to bear worship. They're here to bear witness. And that means that Jesus' words in Luke 19 are not less powerful than the way we often preach them. They're maybe more powerful. Jesus' kingship will be testified to one way or another. Either it will be testified to by joyful disciples who recognize the king, or it will be testified to by the shattered stones of a city that refused the things that make for peace. So the line I would leave you with is this. In Luke 19, the stones are not waiting to sing, they're waiting to testify.